The security guard looked at me like I'd just crawled out from under a rock. His eyes swept from my faded jeans to my old college sweatshirt, and I could practically see him calculating my net worth at about $12 and some pocket lint. He stepped forward, blocking my path to the Grand Meridian Hotel's main entrance with all the authority of someone who'd been doing this job for exactly 3 days. I told him I was here for the Wong Ashford engagement party, and the smirk that crossed his face could have curdled milk. He actually laughed, pointing his thick finger toward the side of the building where a small sign read, "Service Entrance." Apparently, the help needed to use the appropriate door. My name is Kinsley Wong. I'm 32 years old, and at that moment, standing in my deliberately casual clothes, I probably looked like I'd gotten lost on my way to deliver takeout. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering what I actually did for a living, but I kept my mouth shut. Sometimes the best revenge is served in courses, like a 5-star meal. Before I continue, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Thank you. My sister Madison had called me 2 weeks ago with the enthusiasm of someone inviting you to their own execution. She'd made it crystal clear that I should try to look presentable for once, because her future in-laws, the Ashfords, were very particular people. She'd actually used air quotes over the phone. I could hear them in her voice. She also mentioned, so casually, that maybe I shouldn't mention my little online business thing because the Ashfords were old money and wouldn't understand internet jobs. The security guard was still staring at me, his radio crackling with importance. I could have shown him my ID, could have made one phone call that would have changed everything. But where was the fun in that? Instead, I smiled sweetly and headed toward the service entrance, my beat-up sneakers squeaking against the pavement. Just as I reached the side door, a familiar voice shrieked across the parking lot. Madison herself, resplendent in what looked like a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, came clicking across the asphalt in heels that definitely weren't made for walking. Her face was a masterpiece of confusion and barely concealed horror. She looked right at me, then through me, then at the security guard, who was explaining that he'd redirected the delivery person to the proper entrance. Madison actually giggled, that same nervous laugh she'd had since high school when she was embarrassed by association. She waved her manicured hand dismissively and said something about how these people always get confused about where they belong. These people, her own sister. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper and walked through that service entrance with my head held high. The kitchen was chaos, pure, beautiful chaos that smelled like garlic and expensive beef. Wellington, a sous chef, immediately mistook me for the replacement server they'd been expecting and shoved an apron into my hands before I could protest. The head chef, a mountain of a man named Philippe, who seemed to communicate entirely in French curse words and disappointed sighs, took one look at me and declared I was on shrimp duty. Within minutes, I was elbow deep in crustaceans, peeling and deveining like my life depended on it. The other kitchen staff barely noticed the new addition to their ranks. They were too busy gossiping about the disaster unfolding upstairs. Apparently, Madison had already sent 3 champagne deliveries back for not being champagne-colored enough, whatever that meant. The servers were taking bets on how many times she'd change her mind about the napkin arrangement. The current count was 6, and the party hadn't even officially started. I learned more about my sister in that kitchen than I had in the past 5 years of sporadic family dinners. She'd been terrorizing the staff for weeks with her demands, changing the menu 17 times and insisting that the flowers be flown in from Ecuador because local roses looked too pedestrian. One server mentioned she'd actually made the pastry chef cry over the engagement cake design. But the real tea, as the younger servers called it, was about the Ashfords. Old money, they said. So old it had practically turned to dust, Mrs. Ashford had arrived earlier to inspect the venue and spent 40 minutes explaining how their family had been hosting parties since before the hotel was even built. She'd name-dropped so many dead relatives, I thought we might need to set up a memorial table. The kitchen door burst open like someone had kicked it, and there stood Madison in all her bridezilla glory. Her face was the particular shade of red that meant someone, somewhere, had done something unforgivable, like breathing incorrectly. She stormed through the kitchen, her heels clicking like angry typewriter keys, demanding to know why the champagne wasn't properly chilled to exactly 37.5 degrees. Felipe tried to explain that the champagne was at the perfect serving temperature, but Madison wasn't interested in facts. She wanted what she wanted, and what she wanted was perfection that would impress the Ashfords. She swept past the prep station where I was wrist-deep in shrimp, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one she'd borrowed from my apartment 3 years ago and never returned. She didn't even glance my way. To her, I was just another invisible pair of hands making her perfect day possible. After she hurricaned her way back out, one of the servers muttered that the Ashfords were already upstairs telling anyone who'd listen that their son could have done better. The kid washing dishes laughed and said he'd overheard Mrs. Ashford in the bathroom on the phone, discussing how to convince her son to call off the engagement before it was too late. I kept peeling shrimp, but my mind was racing. The Ashfords trying to sabotage my sister's engagement, Madison being a terror to the staff. This was turning into quite the soap opera, and I hadn't even made it to the main event yet. I finished my shrimp duty, told Philippe I needed a bathroom break, and slipped out of the kitchen with my apron still on. The service elevator was empty, which was perfect because I needed a moment to myself. I pressed the button for the penthouse floor, not the party floor, but the one above it, the executive level, my level. 3 years ago, I'd bought the Grand Meridian Hotel chain, not just this hotel, all 17 properties across the country. The deal had been conducted through my holding company, K2 Enterprises, and I deliberately kept my personal name off most of the paperwork. It was cleaner that way, and it meant I could walk through my properties without being treated like the owner. You learn a lot about your business when people don't know you're the boss. The elevator opened to my private office suite, and I used my thumbprint to unlock the door. The space was everything the party downstairs wasn't. Quiet, minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My assistant had left the weekly reports on my desk, but I wasn't interested in numbers right now. I was interested in the security monitors that showed every public area of the hotel. I flipped through the cameras until I found the ballroom. There they were, the Ashfords, in all their glory. Mrs. Ashford looked like she'd been vacuum-sealed into her dress, and her face had that peculiar tightness that suggested her plastic surgeon had been a bit enthusiastic with the Botox. She was holding court near the bar, surrounded by a group of women who all looked like they'd been ordered from the same country club catalog. The story of how I'd built this empire while my family thought I was struggling with a little online business was almost funny. In hindsight, Madison had been so proud of her marketing job at a mid-tier company, always quick to offer me career advice and job listings she'd found that might be more suitable for someone with my limited experience. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly building a hospitality empire, starting with one struggling hotel I'd bought with every penny of my savings and a loan that had kept me up at night for months. The renovation had been brutal, but I'd done a lot of the work myself, learning the business from the ground up. That hotel had led to another, then another, until I had a portfolio that would make those old money Ashfords weep into their trust funds. If you're still with me and enjoying this tale of family drama and hidden success, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your support helps more than you know, and trust me, the best part is yet to come. I zoomed in on one of the security cameras just in time to catch something interesting. Mrs. Ashford was having an intense conversation with someone from the catering staff, not Philippe, or anyone I recognized from the kitchen. She was pressing something into his hand that looked suspiciously like cash. The man nodded and scurried away toward the kitchen. Curious, I pulled up the footage from 5 minutes earlier and watched their entire interaction. The audio was muffled, but the body language was clear. Mrs. Ashford was giving instructions, pointing at various areas of the ballroom, and the man was nodding along like an eager puppy. This wasn't about champagne temperature or napkin arrangements. I made a quick call to my head of security, asking him to keep an eye on the situation but not to intervene yet. Then I changed back into my server's apron. If Mrs. Ashford wanted to play games at my hotel, in my house, well, she was about to learn that the house always wins. The The security footage kept rolling as I watched Madison frantically trying to impress her future mother-in-law, adjusting her dress every time Mrs. Ashford looked her way, laughing too loudly at every terrible joke Mr. Ashford made about his golf game. It was painful to watch, like seeing someone trying to squeeze into shoes that were 3 sizes too small. Back in my server's uniform, I grabbed a tray of champagne glasses from the kitchen and headed into the ballroom. The transformation from the service areas to the party space was like stepping through a portal from Kansas to Oz. If Oz had been decorated by someone with too much money and not enough taste, Madison had gone for what I could only describe as Kardashian meets Downton Abbey. Crystal chandeliers competed with LED uplighting, and there were enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. The Ashfords stood near the center of it all, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Their son, Brett, because of course his name was Brett, stood beside them with the expression of a man being slowly strangled by his own bow tie. I circulated with my tray, invisible in that peculiar way service staff become at fancy parties. Rich people have this amazing ability to take things from your tray while looking right through you, as if the champagne just materialized in their hands through sheer force of will. Mrs. Ashford was holding forth about their family estate in Connecticut, explaining to anyone within earshot how they'd had to let go of some of the staff, because good help is just impossible to find these days. The irony of her saying this while taking a glass from my tray without even glancing at me was not lost. Her husband nodded along, though his eyes kept drifting to the nearest exit. Then I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. Mrs. Ashford was telling Madison about how they'd need to discuss the financial arrangements for the wedding, specifically how Madison's family would be contributing to their son's investment portfolio. She made it sound casual, but I'd negotiated enough business deals to recognize a shakedown when I heard one. Madison was nodding eagerly, promising that her family had resources and that her sister was a very successful investor who would definitely want to contribute to the union. I nearly dropped my tray. Madison was using me, the sister she'd directed to the service entrance, as her imaginary financial backing. Brett's brother, Chase, these names I swear, sidled up to me as I refilled my tray at the service station. He was the type of guy who thought his trust fund made him irresistible, with slicked back hair and a smile that had probably worked on 19-year-old Instagram models. He leaned in close, reeking of cologne and entitlement, and asked if I was working this party all night or if I got breaks. I told him I'd be working until the job was done, and he actually winked at me. Winked, like we were in some bad romantic comedy where the rich boy falls for the servant girl. He slipped what he probably thought was a subtle $100 bill onto my tray and told me to find him later if I wanted to make some real money. The bile rose in my throat, but I smiled and moved away, adding his proposition to my mental list of things that would make this evening even more interesting. As I circulated, I heard more and more pieces of the puzzle. The Ashfords were name-dropping connections they claimed to have, investment opportunities they were pursuing, properties they owned, but something felt off about it all, like they were trying too hard to establish their credentials. During a quiet moment, I slipped into the business center off the main ballroom and pulled out my phone. A few quick searches and some calls to my network revealed what I'd suspected. The Ashfords were broke. Not just a little cash poor, but drowning in debt, selling the family silver broke. Their estate had 3 mortgages on it. Their investment portfolio had been liquidated 2 years ago, and they had liens against them from multiple creditors. Suddenly, everything made sense. They weren't trying to stop the wedding because Madison wasn't good enough for them. They were desperate for it to happen because they thought Madison's family had money. The financial arrangements Mrs. Ashford mentioned weren't contributions. They were hoping for a bailout. The cosmic joke of it all almost made me laugh out loud. Here were the Ashfords, looking down their surgically enhanced noses at everyone, while secretly hoping my sister's imaginary wealthy family would save them from bankruptcy. And here was Madison, pretending to be something she wasn't, to impress people who were pretending even harder. I went back to serving champagne, but now I was really paying attention. Mrs. Ashford was getting bolder, mentioning to her circle of friends how Madison's family would be investing in some of Brett's ventures. Madison stood nearby, smiling and nodding, completely unaware that she was being set up as the golden goose in a con game. The party was in full swing now, the noise level rising with each round of drinks. The man Mrs. Ashford had bribed earlier was doing something suspicious near the sound system, and I watched him palm what looked like a USB drive. Whatever sabotage she'd planned was about to go down, and I needed to decide whether to let it play out or intervene. That's when I spotted my general manager, David, standing at the ballroom entrance with a concerned expression and a folder in his hand. He was scanning the crowd, looking for someone, and I had a pretty good idea what was in that folder. The Ashfords' check for the party had just bounced, and David was here to handle it discreetly. The evening was about to get very interesting. I slipped back into the business center and made a series of phone calls that would have made Madison's head spin if she knew about them. First, my CFO, who confirmed what I'd suspected about the Ashfords' financial situation. They were about 6 weeks away from losing their Connecticut estate to foreclosure. Second, my legal team, who started preparing documents that might come in handy later. Third, and most importantly, David, my general manager, who was still hovering at the ballroom entrance, like a worried father at a teenage party. I told David to give me 20 minutes before approaching anyone about the bounced check. He agreed, though I could hear the confusion in his voice. He knew something was up, but trusted me enough not to ask questions. That's why he was worth every penny of his 6-figure salary, which, incidentally, was probably more than the Ashfords had in all their accounts combined. Back in the ballroom, Madison had commandeered the microphone and was thanking everyone for coming to celebrate their love. She actually used the phrase, joining of two great families, and I watched Mrs. Ashford's face contort into what might have been a smile, if her face could still move that way. The Botox made it look more like she was trying to solve a complicated math problem. Madison went on about how grateful she was to have found Brett, how their families were so perfectly matched, and then, this was the kicker, she announced that her extremely successful investor sister was secretly there tonight, observing everything, and would be making a significant announcement about the wedding later. I nearly choked on my own spit. Madison was using me as a prop in her fantasy, not knowing I was standing 10 feet away holding a tray of crab cakes that no one was eating because Mrs. Ashford had loudly declared them pedestrian. The USB drive guy from earlier was definitely up to something. He'd plugged something into the sound system, and I recognized the setup. In about 5 minutes, whatever audio file Mrs. Ashford had given him would start playing based on the smirk on her face. It wasn't going to be wedding bells. I texted my head of security to download everything from the USB before it could play, then back up all our security footage from the last 2 hours. If Mrs. Ashford wanted to play dirty, she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong hotel to do it in. Chase Ashford cornered me again near the service station, this time with his hand actually on my lower back, telling me about his cryptocurrency ventures and how he could change my life if I was nice to him. The fact that crypto had crashed 3 months ago and his ventures were probably worth less than the lint in my pocket made his proposition even more pathetic. I told him I needed to refill my tray and escaped before I did something that would definitely blow my cover, like explain to him exactly how many times over I could buy and sell his entire family. Philippe emerged from the kitchen looking like he'd just survived a war. Madison had apparently sent him a series of contradictory messages about the dinner service, first moving it up by 30 minutes, then back by 45, then to the original time but with a completely different menu. The kitchen staff was ready to mutiny, and I didn't blame them. I made an executive decision and told Philippe to serve dinner at the original time with the original menu. He looked at me skeptically. After all, I was just the shrimp girl who'd wandered in from the street. But something in my tone must have convinced him because he nodded and retreated to his kitchen kingdom. The security footage I'd requested was now on my phone, and it was even better than I'd hoped. Not only had Mrs. Ashford bribed someone to sabotage the party, but she'd also been caught on camera going through Madison's purse when my sister had left it at her table. She'd photographed something inside, probably Madison's ID or credit cards. the kind of information you'd need for a background check or credit report. David finally entered the ballroom, folder in hand, and began making his way through the crowd. The band was playing some generic jazz that all sounded the same. The musical equivalent of elevator wallpaper. I watched him approach the head table where both families were seated, the Ashfords looking regal in their borrowed finery, and Madison's parents looking like they'd rather be at home watching Jeopardy! David leaned in to speak quietly, probably asking for Ms. Wong to discuss an urgent matter. I saw Madison's face light up. She assumed he meant her, of course. She stood up, smoothing her dress, ready to handle whatever minor catastrophe had arisen. But David walked right past her. He kept walking, scanning the room, and I knew the moment had come. I set down my serving tray and started walking toward him. Madison was saying something about how he must be confused, that she was Ms. Wong, but David wasn't listening anymore. He'd spotted me. The look on Madison's face when David approached me in my stained server's apron with my hair pulled back in a messy bun, was worth more than all the hotels in my portfolio. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish that had just discovered air wasn't water. David handed me the folder with a professional nod and said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "Ms. Wong, we have a situation with the Ashford party payment. The check has been returned for insufficient funds." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop from space. Madison's face went from confused to mortified to angry in about 3 seconds flat. She started shrieking about how I was ruining her party with my pathetic attempts at humor, and that security needed to remove me immediately. That's when I did something I'd been wanting to do all evening. I untied my apron, folded it neatly, and handed it to a passing server. Then I turned to face the room and said in my best CEO voice, "I think there's been some confusion. I'm Kinsley Wong and I own this hotel. In fact, I own all 17 Grand Meridian hotels." The gasps were audible. Mrs. Ashford's face tried to express shock, but the Botox held firm. Madison looked like someone had just told her Santa Claus was real, but he'd been avoiding her house on purpose. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the ballroom's AV system, a little override feature I'd had installed in all my properties. On the massive screens that had been showing romantic photos of Madison and Brett, security footage began to play. There was Mrs. Ashford, clear as day, bribing the staff member. There she was again, going through Madison's purse. And then the audio file she'd tried to plant started playing through my phone. It was a recording of Madison from some previous conversation, edited to make it sound like she was trash-talking the Ashfords and bragging about taking their money. The room erupted. Mrs. Ashford was trying to explain, but the evidence was literally larger than life on the screens around her. Mr. Ashford looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Brett stood frozen, looking between his mother and Madison like he was watching a tennis match in hell. Chase, the cryptocurrency Casanova, tried to slink away, but I wasn't letting him off that easy. "Oh, Chase," I called out sweetly, "you still want to discuss that business proposition? The one where you offered to change my life if I was nice to you? I have that on recording too, if anyone's interested." His face went from red to white to green, a Christmas color palette of embarrassment. Madison found her voice, and it was not happy. She accused me of sabotaging her engagement, of being jealous, of deliberately humiliating her in front of everyone. She actually used the phrase, "You've always been jealous of me," which would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. I let her rant for a full minute. It was actually impressive how many accusations she could fit into such a short time. Then I held up the folder David had given me. "The Ashfords' check bounced," I said simply. "They don't have the money to pay for this party. In fact, according to public records, they don't have money for much of anything. 3 mortgages on the family estate, Brett's trust fund emptied 2 years ago, and about 15 maxed-out credit cards between them." Mrs. Ashford tried to protest, but I pulled up the public records on my phone and projected those onto the screens too. Property records, court documents, all publicly available information that anyone could find if they bothered to look. "You were planning to use Madison for money," I continued. "Money you thought her family had. Money you thought I had. Well, you were half right, I do have money. But you're not getting a penny of it. I turned to Madison, who had gone from angry to devastated. "They've been playing you from the start. Mrs. Ashford hired a private investigator to look into our family. I have the invoice right here. Charged to a credit card that's currently over its limit, by the way." The room was in chaos. Guests were whispering, some were openly recording on their phones, and the Ashfords looked like they were melting into their chairs. But the best part was yet to come. "Now," I announced, "let's discuss the bill for tonight's party. It's $47,000, not including gratuity. Since the Ashfords can't pay, and since this is technically their son's engagement party, I have two options. 1, I call the police and report theft of services. Or 2, the Ashfords can leave now, quietly, and I'll absorb the cost as a wedding gift to my sister, assuming there's still going to be a wedding." Brett finally spoke up and surprised everyone. He turned to Madison with tears in his eyes and said he had no idea about his parents' schemes. He admitted he knew they were broke, but thought they were handling it with dignity, not by trying to con his fiancé's family. Madison was crying now, her carefully applied makeup running in designer streams down her face. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time all evening, and whispered, "You own this place, all of them." But I thought, "Your online thing." "My online thing was the platform I built to manage hotel bookings," I explained. "It became so successful that I used the profits to buy my first hotel, then another, then the entire chain I tried to tell you multiple times, but you always changed the subject when I talked about work. The Ashfords were trying to leave quietly, but I had one more card to play. Mrs. Ashford, the gentleman you bribed to sabotage the party, he's actually one of my security team. We have your entire conversation on tape, including the part where you discussed ruining the party to make Madison look bad so Brett would call off the engagement. Would you like me to play that for everyone?" She shook her head violently, grabbed her husband's arm, and practically ran for the exit. Chase tried to follow, but not before muttering something about how this was all a misunderstanding. The security guard from the beginning of the evening, remember him, was standing by the door, and the look of horror on his face when he realized who I was almost made me feel bad. Almost. The ballroom cleared out pretty quickly after that. Nothing kills a party like finding out the hosts are broke, and the bride's sister owns the venue. Madison and Brett sat at their table, surrounded by expensive centerpieces and broken dreams. My parents, who'd been silent through the entire ordeal, were staring at me like I'd just announced I was from Mars. Madison finally stood up and walked over to me. Her shoulders were shaking and I expected another tirade. Instead, she threw her arms around me and sobbed into my shoulder, completely ruining my old college sweatshirt with her makeup. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you. I didn't want to see you. I was so obsessed with being something I'm not that I couldn't see who you really were." I hugged her back because, despite everything, she was still my sister. "You want to know the really sad part?" I said. "If you just asked, I would have helped. No questions asked. That's what family does." Brett approached us nervously, like he was afraid I might have him thrown out too, but I could see he was genuinely devastated by his parents' behavior. He apologized profusely, said he understood if Madison wanted to call off the engagement, and even offered to work to pay back the party costs. Madison looked at him, then at me, then back at him. "Your parents are terrible," she said bluntly, like spectacularly terrible. "But you stood up to them, and you're nothing like them. So if you still want to marry me, knowing that I'm not rich, that I've been pretending to be someone I'm not, and that I've been horrible to my amazing sister, then yes." It wasn't the most romantic proposal acceptance I'd ever seen, but it was honest, which was more than anyone had been all evening. I offered Madison a job the next day, not out of pity, but because anyone who could organize an event with that many moving pieces, even if it was a disaster, had skills she needed to learn humility and how to treat people with respect. And what better place than starting from the bottom in the hotel industry? "You're going to work in every department," I told her. "Kitchen, housekeeping, front desk, everything. You're going to learn this business from the ground up, and you're going to apologize to every staff member you terrorized today." She nodded eagerly, mascara still streaming down her face. Brett said he wanted to work too, to earn his own money for once instead of living off his family's reputation. I told him I'd find him something in our accounting department. Turns out he had a degree in finance his parents had never let him use. The security guard from the beginning found me as I was leaving. He apologized about 17 times in 30 seconds, which might have been a record. I told him he was just doing his job, but maybe next time he should look at people's faces instead of their clothes. He nodded so hard I thought his head might fall off. Philippe and the kitchen staff got the rest of the night off with full pay, plus a bonus for dealing with Madison's chaos. The party food got donated to a local shelter, and the flowers went to a nearby nursing home. Nothing went to waste except the Ashfords' dignity, but they didn't have much of that to begin with. A week later, Madison started her first shift in housekeeping at 5 a.m. She texted me a picture of herself in the uniform, smiling despite the early hour. "Day one of learning who I really am," she wrote. Brett was in the accounting department, discovering he was actually good at something other than spending money. He and Madison moved into a small apartment, paying their own rent for the first time. They seemed happier than I'd ever seen them. As for the Ashfords, they lost their estate 2 months later. Mrs. Ashford tried to sue me for defamation. But it's hard to claim defamation when everything said about you is true, and on video they moved to Florida, where they're probably trying to con other unsuspecting families with eligible daughters. The security footage from that night became legendary among my staff. Someone set it to music, Gold Digger naturally, and it became our unofficial training video for how not to treat people. Madison and Brett got married a year later in a simple ceremony in my hotel's garden. No pretense, no lies, just two people who'd learned the hard way that being yourself is always better than pretending to be someone you're not. Madison insisted on using the service entrance for her bridal entrance. She said it was where her real journey began.